I think the Gulen Institute is a perfect forum for today's subject, which is to discuss 21st century leadership. 21st century leadership, I think, is something that needs to come to the fore quickly. Some have described the transition taking place next week in Washington as the last 20th century administration giving way to the first 21st century administration. For me, when I think about the 20th century and leadership in the 20th century, I can't but help think about the tens of millions of people who died in violence. I can't help but think of the enormous poverty and the enormous lack of food, malnutrition, lack of health that permeates the world. And the Gulen Institute, of course, standing for the highest human values that we can imagine, is really a place where leadership is at the core of our future as represented by high human values. All around the world, I've asked the following question. Who were the most outstanding leaders in the 20th century, and what did they have in common? And that usually leads to a lot of responses, and people bring up names of famous people, names of military generals, of presidents, of prime ministers, of academic individuals. But almost nobody answers the question fully. And it's not a trick question. Who were the three most important leaders of the 20th century, and what did they have in common? And rather than go through a question-asking process, I'll give you the answer. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. What did they have in common? Each of them believed in peaceful nonviolence as a mechanism for change. They were not responsible for the deaths of people, as presidents and prime ministers throughout the course of the 20th century regrettably were responsible. Secondly, they all had the courage of their convictions and served time in jail because of that. And thirdly, in a century that was clearly dominated by the last vestiges of European colonialism, there were three persons of color who at the time of their leadership ascension were often looked at askance because of their color. Three leaders that stood for what is important, which is human dignity and freedom and the rights of man. So the 20th century did some very good things, but the 20th century also was a century of extremes, as we saw in my description of the violence, the poverty, the malnutrition, the ill health of millions and millions of fellow citizens. In an organizational sense, we learned a lot in the 20th century. People like Peter Drucker taught us about the art of managing, called leadership, talked about structures and processes, tasks, responsibilities, accountabilities. Very important to put a dogma around management and leadership. We learned a lot about other kinds of organizational leadership. How many of us sat in quality circles? How many of us are familiar with the walk the talk and other kinds of management initiatives which are very important to leaders? The engagement process, the communications process. And so we went through all kinds of leadership initiatives, restructuring, offshoring, outsourcing, all kinds of leadership initiatives designed to drive productivity in organizations so businesses could be more successful, each of which had a benefit, each of which had a cost, whether it was a financial cost, oftentimes a social cost, or other kinds of burdens that we placed on employees. But leadership in the 20th century also saw in addition to its progress, it saw some abuses. The abuses of learning how to take tax advantages and stretch the rules of accounting. Abuses that led to something that is still in this country and around the world, a moose on the table, where we don't like to acknowledge there's a moose on the table, and that is the issue of egregious executive greed and what the implications and consequences of executive greed are all about. If you're watching CNBC these days, there's a series called American Greed, not exactly our shining moment in the leadership of the business world. And that egregious executive greed and the manifestation now of the financial collapse, the housing collapse, other bubble collapses, if you recall the dot-com collapse of the latter part of the last century, fueled, unfortunately, by motives that are anything but in society's best interest. So as we think about the 20th century and we put a lid on it, and we can think about some of the good things that happened, people leading mega corporations, which do produce tremendous goods and services for this world to lift the material well-being of the world, not all bad. If you think about the efforts for peace led by many leaders, not always successfully, but in the common interest, well-motivated, well-intended, but maybe not as successful as we would like. We turn now to the 21st century. We turn now to the challenges of cleaning up after the dirtiest century in the history of the world, in terms of our environment, our land, our water, our air. Cleaning up after the worst recession, where the causes of today's recession started in the last century. Cleaning up in areas of the world where we have not seen peace in decades, and we see disrespect and mistrust and hatred fueling too many geographic disputes. Living in a world of insecurity where President-elect Obama said on Sunday, his first and continuing priority will and always will be the security of the homeland, where we can't rest a moment because of those who are our enemies. So what about that 21st century leader? What does it take? Whether it's a business leader, a leader of government, a leader of communities, a leader in society, what does it take for that leader to make a difference? Having studied this for most of 5 decades, and having discussed with people around the world, and having witnessed tremendous examples of great leadership and tremendous examples of not so great leadership, having studied Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela over the years and known people who knew them, what are